This afternoon we're going to talk about financial instruments. My name, of course, is Dave Coker. Before we get into today's lecture, let's talk about what we discussed last time. And in our last lecture, we talked about mutual funds. We talked about lots of different funds. We also discussed ETFs, or exchange-traded funds. And we tried to talk about mutual funds. We tried to understand the way they go about their business, and we compared and contrasted with exchange-traded funds, or ETFs. We also talked about hedge funds. We tried to understand why hedge funds arose, and we tried to understand what advantages hedge funds brought to the equation. Why would we be interested in a hedge fund as opposed to a mutual fund or an ETF, things along those lines. We also talked about fee structures in the context of hedge funds and why it's so important to understand the fees that are associated with a hedge fund. And finally, we discussed prime brokerages, or the services that these brokers provide to their clients, who, of course, are almost always hedge funds. What are we going to do today? Well, today we're going to talk about derivatives. We're going to introduce derivatives. We're going to talk about them at a very high level. We're going to introduce some formulas, and we're going to talk about forward contracts. We're going to talk about futures contracts, and we're going to talk about swaps. We're also going to talk about options, and we're going to discuss two different classes of options, American versus European. We're going to talk about options. We're going to compare them at a high level to futures and forwards and try to understand the use of each one of these different types of instruments. We're going to discuss exotic options, and finally we're going to introduce structured products. So when we start to look at the financial markets, we can see that there's two broad classes for derivatives. There's exchange-traded and over-the-counter. Let's look very broad, at a very high level of these two types of the markets and try to understand exactly what goes on there.